Hi, everyone. My name is Seanna. I am currently an incoming PhD student at the University of Virginia in the English department. I spent most of last year doing research in Barbados, actually in collaboration with UE, doing research on Black speculative fiction. And I connected with this group because of, the work that can occur between Black speculative fiction writing and the Runaway slave ads. So this workshop will focus on using speculative writing to tell the stories and narratives that can come from these slave ads. And I'll get a little into exactly what speculative writing is, just to make that distinction, but it's not as complicated as folks usually think it is. All right, so to get started. So why use speculative/creative writing to engage with the runaway slave ads? And just to make it clear, speculative writing really is a form of writing or genre that takes on the question of what if, journeying into the imagination, the hypothetical. And as a result, it falls under creative writing, but creative writing itself doesn't necessarily have to be in that genre of what if or the hypothetical. It could very much be realistic, but just be taken on in a creative way. And so I will explore in the next two slides why this form of writing is very useful for the runaway slave ads. All right, so this form of writing has actually been used previously as a tool to explore the Caribbean's history. Many writers have previously used fiction as a way to reimagine Caribbean histories that are impossible or almost impossible to access. And this is mainly because the Caribbean's history is so, it's so affected by events such as colonialism and slavery. And as a result, there are a lot of gaps and narratives and stories that just haven't been recorded and that are very hard to visit today. So as a result, writers to the right, among many, have used writing as a way to engage with those lost histories, to reimagine what this history looks like, what Caribbean people, their identity and culture looked like. And so at the top we have Norbese Philip in her book of poetry, which is titled Song. It covers the massacre of 150 African slaves in the form of poetry, which is not only very creative in the sense of she plays around with words on the page, but it's very accessible for audience and readers. And then we have they're both renowned, but renowned Derek Walcott, who is also a poet. He also does plays amongst many other kinds of creative writing. But the Sea is History poem is very relevant for using writing as a tool to explore the Caribbean's history. As we see in the poem where he explores the lost history of the Caribbean through the metaphor of the sea. He also has a noble lecture where he compares the history of the Caribbean to a fragmented vase. He says that these fragments that have been shattered as a result of colonialism and slavery kind of represent the identity and culture of the Caribbean before such events came into play. And in this essay, he proposes using poetry as a way to put these fragments together. And I really think that that is what many of these writers are doing when they're taking on writing as a tool to explore these lost histories, and that I think we're similarly doing when engaging with the runaway slave ads. And so here I have a few more titles because there are just so many great writers in text that engage with this work. The first two, Octavia E. Butler's Kindred and Toni Morrison's Beloved, are actually by two African-American women writers who engage with slavery in the United States. And they both actually use the elements of speculative fiction. In Kindred, Butler is the first African-American woman writer to use time travel in a slave narrative, while Toni Morrison uses idea of like ghost and haunting to engage with, ideas of slavery that kind of persists even into our present today. And I just noticed this earlier, but I think it's really interesting that in the cover of the graphic novel for Kindred, replacing the kind of cuffs around her hands is an infinity symbol, which I hadn't noticed before. And I think that really speaks to, this ongoing legacy of slavery that I think both books do a great job of really prompting readers to consider. And so the two other books to the right are Nalo Hopkinson's The Salt Roads and Marlon James' The Book of Night Women. And they're both Caribbean writers, and as a result, or not really result, but they both write about slavery in the Caribbean, which I think is very different from slavery in the US. Not to compare trauma or pain, but the conditions of slavery in the Caribbean were different just by virtue of location and the amount of bodies that existed on islands. So because it was on an island, it was almost impossible to escape, similar to the way that escape was possible in the States, where slaves could move from the South to the North. And also because of the mass number of bodies in the Caribbean, like bodies were seen as more expendable. And it's really hard to say that because I'm not trying to privilege one over the other, but because of the amount of bodies, a lot of more gruesome treatment was enacted towards slaves. Which, if you read Marlon James' The Book of Night Women, you should keep in mind, because that is one of the most gruesome texts about slavery I have ever read. It took me like weeks to get through the book because I would put it down several times just because of how raw it was in its content. So I just wanted to highlight that if you do choose to read it. And also, one more thing about Kindred is that it was published in 1979 as a novel. But the cover that you're seeing right there is the graphic novel because it was adapted in 2017. So the book takes on both the novel form and the graphic novel form, which has its differences, and we'll get into a little later, but just wanted to make that distinction there before we move forward. Okay, and so here are two quotes from an interview between Professor Najole Hamilton, who teaches at the University of Virginia, and the acclaimed Caribbean writer Lauren Scott, who really engages with the power of memory and of the imagination in his work. And so in the interview, I was really propelled by these two quotes, which read, "I cannot remember, so I imagine. Writing as fiction, the history that hasn't been written." And so what I really want to emphasize with these two quotes is that because of this inability to access traditional or written records of the Caribbean, these writers have turned to fiction and creative writing as a way to remember, because of that lack prompted by, the lack of archives that we currently have around the Caribbean's history. And so I just want to remind you all that as you engage with creative writing with these slave ads, that that inability to remember is what is prompting your ability to, imagine and to go into the realm of the hypothetical. Yeah. And so I also want to clarify that as you hear the rest of my presentation, I encourage you all to think about, what it is you might want to write about, as well as what form you might want to take on. And so here on the left, I have different creative writing forms that you can pursue. Fiction, as exemplified by the writers that I just spoke about. Short stories are more manageable unless you're planning on writing a novel, then I totally support you. There's poems, there's plays, there's songs, there's graphic novels, stories, comics. And with these forms, I really encourage you to just take stock of what you personally prefer, because that's what it all depends on. It depends on what you feel comfortable doing. Like maybe you have prior experience with one of these forms or more. I know that I've previously done poetry in the past, and as a result, when I look at these ads and I imagine the creative writing that I can do, I gravitate towards poems because that's what I've done. But it's also okay if you haven't done any of these forms. This workshop is for everyone at every level. If I was more musically inclined, I would do songs. If I could draw, I would definitely try to take on graphic novels, but I'll just stick to poems for now. I also want to highlight the purpose of using these creative forms, are really using creative writing to engage with these ads. And so first, we're providing voice and agency to the folks in the ads. As you see in the ads, there's very limited information present, some more than others. And, I understand the premise of the ads, but it's very dehumanizing to not know furthermore information about these folks because they're only seen as property, whereas we're here left wondering what these people's livelihoods and beings looked like. And so I think that by, writing about the folks that we're seeing in these ads, we're giving them voice and the agency that wasn't afforded to them because of, slavery and the way that these ads were written, or the way that history has been written. And another purpose is, challenging and unraveling common narratives that often exist around slavery or that stem from slavery. So, for instance, one scholar who writes about Butler's work, the woman who wrote Kindred, asserts that she rewrites the disparaging stereotyped mammy image that stems from slavery by highlighting instead enslaved women's role in making circumstances better for their community and their strength. And if you're not familiar with the mammy image, it is a US stereotype for a Black woman who worked in a white family and nursed the family's children. And often this woman is portrayed as passive and overly nice. And this image and stereotype is very offensive and is portrayed very offensively in many media forms and pop culture today. And so what's really cool or really empowering about Butler's work is that she rewrites that stereotype and instead gives agency to the women who would otherwise be identified as the mammy. And so that is an example of the kind of work that you can take on with writing about the folks in these ads, is, debunking those common narratives that exist around certain bodies and certain identities. And, lastly, these forms of creative writing are accomplishing a form of healing. I believe that in an essay that Walcott writes, he says that amnesia is the true history of the New World. And really, he's referring to this cultural amnesia that exists as a result of, the lack of formal archives of the histories that we're engaging with. And so by writing these stories, by rewriting these assumptions that often exist, we're healing that forgetfulness, that amnesia, or that inability to really remember the people and culture that came before colonialism and slavery, or the effects of those two events. And again, this all depends on personal preference, what form you want to take on, or really what you want to accomplish. I think it's helpful to, think about this beforehand and kind of brainstorm some ideas or goals that you might have in mind. And so when thinking about curing a cultural amnesia for a certain group of people, I really wanted to highlight the work of Dr. Rebecca Hall, who she is working on a graphic novel titled The Wake, A Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts. And her work was inspired by the New York slave revolt of 1712, when over 20 Black slaves set fire to several houses of white slave owners and fatally shot 9. And so although there are, the history has been maintained of this event, sources have often stated that these rebels were all men, which create a very gendered narrative. Dr. Hall wanted to read against the grain, and instead she identified 4 women who were captured and tried, but who have just been erased from the history books for this event. And so in her graphic novel, she really wants to highlight the stories and roles of women in slave revolts, especially in this vivid form. So as I was just talking about the form that you can take on, Dr. Hall shares why she chooses to tell the stories in a vivid form. One is to make the work more accessible. Often when engaging with lost history, it's talked about in discourse that is very academic, very inaccessible to all communities. And so by choosing a graphic novel form, making it more like readable to all folks outside of academia or whatever it may be. And second, she uses the vivid form or the graphic novel to explore the emotional possibilities of this medium. And so to kind of demonstrate what that means, like I have done work on Kindred. I wrote my entire thesis on Kindred, but on the novel. And so if you have any question about that text, just let me know. But I have not read the graphic novel, and that is by preference, just because I don't think I'm quite ready to engage with the emotions that will be prompted from reading the text from a vivid form now. So I very much understand her purpose in wanting to explore the emotional possibilities of this form. I would love to check out her work, but as for Kindred's graphic novel, I'm not quite there yet. And I also want to highlight that she was told in the process from advisors and folks around her that she would not find any sources. And although that is kind of true, she did find sources, just not the traditional forms that you would use. So for instance, she was left to parse documents such as insurance policies, ship logs, and court records. And so when you see these documents, you don't necessarily think that you're going to be getting the narratives and, you know, backgrounds of the folks that you're writing the work for, such as these 4 women. But by parsing these documents, she was able to kind of parse out information that would complement her work. So for instance, when giving these women backstories, she's also giving them agency. Her characters wreak havoc on slave ships and are portrayed as weapon-wielding warriors. And while this may seem very hypothetical and just out of the imagination, it's actually based on the research that she was able to perform from certain documents, which was based on the all-female martial traditions in some West African nations. And if you're familiar with Black Panther, then you can kind of compare the two and see where she's coming from in this light. So just really highlighting that although the material that we have to work with is limited, it ultimately becomes like a great space to work from and like complement as we're telling these people's narratives or stories. And in the article that will also be posted to the resources page for this workshop, I found this really great quote from her that reads, "Finding African-American history in general is about reading sources against the grain. Sometimes I feel like I'm more so describing the shape of an absence." And so I really wanted to highlight this quote because I want to remind y'all that, you know, working with this absence or the shape of this absence can be really frustrating, but know that there is a lineage and, you know, community of writers who have been doing this work and continue to do this work, and that reading against the grain is necessary for certain communities, such as the women that Hall writes about in the slave revolt, and that it's just necessary to do this kind of work. But also that these absences can be very telling, you know, what isn't included in the information we're presented. It was the lack of women in the history of this, the New York slave revolt that prompted Hall to look further into seeing whether women were involved, and they were, and now she has this amazing work. So yeah, hold on to that. And now to talk about the information that we will find in the ads. This is the more technical part of the workshop, kind of ways to approach reading the ads and using that reading to inform the kind of creative work that you'll pursue. So of course, names are, I would say, very important to identify, not just the names of the runaway slaves themselves, but of slave owners or like family or friends that are mentioned. This isn't necessarily the case for all of the ads, but it is helpful when it is mentioned. Age is important, appearance, skin color. In the last workshop, Nicholas noted that usually folks described as yellow or mixed. And this can be very important in, you know, creating a story where you might want to provide background to the folks that you're working with. For instance, we know that when someone is more lighter skinned, that they're mixed, and at least in the conditions of slavery, the idea of being mixed unfortunately stems from, the rape of many enslaved women, because that was a violence that their body was often subject to. And so I think that's also an important thing to consider is, although like we didn't get these written narratives from women about their experiences with rape, that we nonetheless know that they occurred. And so skin color can indicate that. Also clothes and any other features can be important, such as marks of their country, the tribes that they're coming from, and or signs of violence. A few of these ads do mention, distinguishing marks or injuries that, they're not going to quite tell us, this came from this kind of punishment or from a slave owner, but we nonetheless know that because of the conditions of slavery, this is where these signs of violence come from. And lastly, information about family and friends can be great to take note of, because if you choose to write about the perspective of one of these folks, then you'll at least have some information, or just, building plot and having networks of community for the folks you're writing about is really helpful. And so I suggest that, when reading the ads, when choosing an ad, have a piece of paper next to you or whatever it may be, and just kind of take notes and identify all these pieces of information, so that, say, when you begin the creative process of writing, you can always just refer to your notes. I'm a very visual person and like to draw like little like mind maps, and like that helps me with getting through my writing process. So just suggesting that if that works for people. And it also might be helpful to write up a transcription. I'm definitely not used to this form of writing that's present in the ads, and I read at a slower pace when going through them. So I think it's helpful to, write up a contemporary translation. And I highly recommend that if folks struggle like me. And so for this part of the workshop, I want you to consider questions that can be helpful for you to process, what you're reading and engaging with in the ads. So the first question is, what responses or emotions are evoked for you personally when reading the slave ads? These initial feelings can really help you decide what it is you want your audience to take away from your piece. Why was it that you felt so motivated to work with this specific piece? What emotions do you then want to prompt, say, for your readers? Are they going to be similar to what you felt, or would you want them to feel something else? I think just really taking a moment to consider and reflect on what it was like for you to read a certain slave ad, especially when thinking about a certain slave ad in comparison to others that you might have read, as I'll demonstrate later in the workshop. And the next question is, what information is available as well as not available? So obviously with information that's available, you can do the process of taking your notes, but you can also think about, why was this information made available? What purpose could there have been? Is it just for the reason of trying to, identify this person and have them, be captured? Or was this information present for other reasons? And that also goes into the question of what information is not available, because as Dr. Hall, presented to us, you're describing an absence. And so with that absence, like, what is it that you want readers to reflect on or think about when this information wasn't presented to them or to you when reading the slave ad? And so with that absence or gap, the next question is, do you want to fill in those perceived gaps? Do you want to provide voice to the person's mentions, or even to other folks who aren't mentioned? Again, just think about why those absences might exist. Like, why weren't networks of family and friends included, or why was such limited information offered about the person that the ad is about? These questions and your responses to these questions can really help the direction of where you want to go with your story, or what you want your readers to pull away. And that lastly gets into the question of, what theme or message might you want to engage with? So like, is there a goal that you have in mind with what your audience is going to be able to take away from your piece? Are there stereotypes or assumptions you want to counter, similar to Butler and the mammy image? I actually just finished a slave narrative by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It was published in 2019, so very recent. And in the text, he has a main character who is mixed, and as a result, assumed that because his father was the owner of the plantation, he could potentially arise above the treatment of his enslaved peers. And so, although that wasn't like the overall like theme or message that Coates was engaging with in the text, it was a message that I personally thought about and considered as I was reading his work. And by the end, like, I'm not gonna spoil the text because I can never do that, but like, he very much counters that assumption that the main character has, and assumptions that we might have had about the main character's mixed identity. So just consider that you can have one theme or a bunch of themes or messages that you want readers to take away. That's why I suggest brainstorming beforehand with goals that you might have in mind. But yes, we can now talk about creative elements that you can utilize. So first of all, point of view is very important. You can write from any point of view that you prefer, really, whether it be the slaves, the enslaved folks in the ads that are identified. It can be kin or friends that are mentioned or not mentioned, as well as even slave owners. I don't know if it was Marlon James' piece, but there was actually a slave narrative where a chapter took the perspective of the wife of the slave owner, which was really interesting because there's this stereotype or common assumption that all of the wives of slave owners were jealous, and that's why they treated enslaved women so badly. But when writing from the perspective of this woman, the audience was able to instead get perspective and understand that like she wasn't this jealous, unhinged woman, but really she just couldn't bear like her position in the plantation as like the wife of this man who was raping and enacting several violences on bodies around her, but that she just had no agency to stop. So I say all of that to say that like you don't necessarily always have to write from the point of view of the slaves in the ads. You can take on various bodies and identities and just see like what it is that you want to accomplish with doing this. I thought that was a really profound chapter in the book, just because it made me think about other possibilities of being during the times of slavery other than what had been offered to me in most media forms. And so setting and character development are also important to consider, because sometimes in some of the ads, there is information about parts of Barbados that, they were last seen or believed to be harbored. And you can definitely use setting to enhance your story. I know that if I were to write a poem and I knew the part of Barbados that, it took place in, the slave, where the enslaved person was believed to be, I would definitely try to describe the landscape of that space, just to like, make the piece more personable and like easier to imagine. So I think it's helpful to utilize setting. For character development, this is really up to you. It really depends on how long your piece is, whether you want some kind of personal change to occur. I know that for me, within the piece of poetry that I would do, I'm not sure whether I would use character development or dialogue, even just because of the length of poetry that I tend to do. But if you imagine that as really propelling the creative pieces that you would love to pursue, then definitely I encourage you to use those elements. And lastly, for underlying theme or message, again, like, let this always kind of ground you in your work and why you're doing this, this creative piece, why you're working with a specific ad. It can be helpful to, remind yourself when the process can be frustrating. I know when I get writer's block, it's really helpful to look back at my overall goal or what I want to kind of impart through this creative piece. So I encourage folks to use all of these creative elements, or just a few. It's really up to your preference or what form you take on, but this will definitely help you build up your story. And so I've also included an example of me identifying and working closely with ads, just to kind of highlight what the process looks like when we take all of these slides together. And so I have this ad from January 3rd, 1784, about an enslaved woman named Molly. I'll read it briefly. A runaway from the subscriber, a Negro woman named Molly, was formerly the property of Mr. James Carter, a schoolmaster in St. Philip's Parish. Afterwards, the property of Mr. Henry Pollard, and then of Robert Kennedy, a free mulatto. She has lost her little toe of her left foot. Whoever will deliver her to her master shall receive a motor reward, and whoever harbors or conceals her may depend on having the law put in force against them. And so on the right of this ad, I have included the notes that I written when I was engaging with this ad. It's not all my notes because it just wouldn't be able to fit, but just once I think really highlight what I've included in this presentation for working with these ads. So first I took stock of my initial feelings, which were feeling really dissatisfied by the lack of information. You know, like most of these ads will be very limiting in the information, but you know, when reading this ad in relatively to other ads that focused on men, you know, there is considerably less information present about Molly. There's nothing about friends or kin mentioned, not even about her clothing, or more so about her appearance, just about her little toe. And so I was just very dissatisfied with that because, like, as a woman, I, you know, identified more with ads about women, and as a result wanted to work with those ads. And as a result, I was just, you know, disappointed that more wasn't given and that there were just a lack of details relative to ads about men. I'm just gonna check this chat real quick. Okay, cool. Just want to make sure I was on track. All right, and I also included a transcription. This isn't the full transcription, but this is just an example of me writing up what is present in the ad so that I don't have to struggle through the style of language in this ad. So a runaway from the subscriber, a Negro woman named Molly was formerly ... And so that's just an example of creating, you know, a transcription that can ultimately help you when, you know, in the process of writing and maybe you forgot something and need to just go back. I personally prefer to use a transcription with that process of checking. And below this bullet, I also have the words poem and short story, because those were the forms that I potentially want to take on. If I had felt inclined to other forms, I would have included that as well, but I'm more so drawn to poetry and the short story form. And below this, I also just have some language that I wrote down next to me that I thought was worth investigating. So for instance, the phrase lost her little toe. The use of the word lost seems so misleading and innocent, as if it was just happened by chance that she lost her foot. When, you know, knowing the conditions of slavery, we know that this most likely occurred from some kind of violence enacted by a slave owner, or just stemming from slavery, the violences of slavery itself. So I took note of that because that's something that I want to counter in my piece, whatever it turns out to be. And also drawn to the language of was once the property of a schoolmaster. I thought this was really interesting because even though this wasn't her last, like the last person that she belonged to, that to be a schoolmaster, did that imply that she was influenced by some form of education? You know, it's impossible to say whether we know she got a form of education just because of belonging to a schoolmaster. But even if she didn't, I like to write that into her narrative just to, you know, provide her agency. The story that I mentioned earlier, from The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates, the main character actually does receive a form of education, and as a result, he's seen as dangerous, of course. And you know, that's a characteristic that I would like to add to Molly and my creative writing of her ad. You know, to not only give her agency, but for her to be seen as dangerous in her resistance of running away and of obtaining some form of knowledge and education. So this is just kind of like an overall like quick image of what this process can look like. It's obviously more in depth. I've only included a few of my notes, but I hope this really highlights, you know, the kind of investigating that you can do from these ads, because although they may feel very limited, there's a lot to parse. And what isn't available, of course, becomes questions that you can answer through your creative pieces. And so to move on. I lastly just wanted to include this quote that I came across. It's from an anthology titled Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements, which I recommend all the texts that I've talked about, but this one particularly given, you know, the wake of the moment that we are currently in with Black Death, unfortunately. And I actually came across this quote because my friends sent me an affirmation deck of cards that is based on Octavia Butler's work. It's pretty cool, and this quote was included. And what's really cool about this deck is that every quote by Butler is accompanied by a question for one to consider and possibly journal on. I know that's what I plan to do. And I found it really interesting that this quote, which says, "Our ancestors dreamed us up and then bent reality to create us," was then accompanied by the question, what ancestor are you honoring today? And so I felt that that was very appropriate and fitting for the work that we're doing today with these slave ads in Barbados. It's not that we're just creating these narratives and writing these stories, but we're really like honoring and giving voice to the lost narratives and to the folks that are included in these ads, whether they're mentioned or not. And I love this idea of, you know, honoring those who came before us, especially as like we're trying to recover these lost histories. So not only do I recommend Octavia's Brood as worth checking out, but, you know, just like considering that question as you engage with the ads, like who are you honoring? Why are you honoring them in this way? And so really that is it for the presentation. I hope that that was helpful in terms of thinking about, you know, what creative forms you want to pursue, like how you can approach these ads from a writing stance. And so now I just welcome any questions that you might have, as well as, you know, any potential ideas that you have that we can just further discuss together. Thank you.